Coming to you from the world of AV, control programming, and automation, I'm Steve Greenblatt along with James King, and this is Ask the Programmer. Hey, James, how are you? It's good to
I'm
be
good.
back for another episode.
Oh, it is great. Great to be back, Steve. I'm good. How about yourself?
Doing great. I'm so excited about the feedback that we've been receiving, and I know that you have as well. And it really exceeded our expectations, especially in the couple of episodes that we've put out. Um, why don't you share a little bit about some of the thoughts that you had gotten and some of the input and requests that came in?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was, I'll admit, 100% shocked by the feedback we got and how quickly. I mean, the videos went up, and within 24 hours, my LinkedIn and Twitter were blowing up with messages, which was great. The first one I really wanted to talk to is probably what this episode is kind of be about is I do apologize if I butchered the name. I'm horrible, but it's 80 ADE is his first name. He sent me a LinkedIn message, um, basically asking like the future of AV programming and how to learn the new languages like HTML5 and CSS and JavaScript.
And I think that that's just a great topic. I know that's something that I'm discussing with my team quite a bit, and as many of the manufacturers are pushing those ideas. Some of it, I think, is pushed along and brought to light by the ending of support of Adobe Flash in browsers, and I think what's nice about that, and before we jump into it, is that it really starts to bring to light how modern programming is now crossing over into the AV world.
100%. It's definitely hitting that market now where it's your traditional IT languages are creeping into the AV programming. And that just goes without going on the side topic here, but that goes into my whole belief that AV is IT. But this is just another subset of it. So I definitely think this is going to be a great topic. Um, with you being a programming company, and you say you're working with your employees, why don't you take that first about how to the future of AV programming? Why don't you take that? Because you're probably more in the weeds than I am there.
So we have a little bit of a unique perspective, and I think that where most of our audience will relate is probably somewhere between where my focus is and where your focus is, and maybe even a third person's. But where what we are seeing is that the easier systems are becoming easier and becoming automated, and are really not requiring the need and the input from skilled or advanced control programmers. And my company being a specialist in that area, we as much as we serve programming companies, programmers, or companies that need programming, we also are competition in some regard, which we don't really look at it that way. But if you think about a pool of programming opportunities, a lot of that has been eroded because getting projects done has become that much easier. So we've had to focus more on what's new, where are things going, where can we be a leader, and what's the new technologies that are going to be in demand almost before they're needed. And so we've actually started to see some companies reaching out saying, hey, we want to get into this HTML5 game, but we're not quite sure how. Can you help us? And I have several people on my team that we've tasked with getting up to speed. In fact, everybody's going to have to over time, because I think that those are the types of opportunities that we're going to be seeing, amongst other things.
Yeah, I can totally agree. And I'll admit, from being a in-house programmer, working for a educational uh, school, is I actually just published this article in the higher ed AV.com digital magazine in my IT and AV column is about hiring programmers, either integrators, third party, and in-house. And that's one of the big downside of having an in-house person is they're not always able to keep up on the latest because they wear many hats. I mean, I personally would love to start learning more HTML5 at work. I don't have the time to do that. So I have a Raspberry Pi I have in my house, which started to teach myself HTML5. Um, so having a resource like a third party programmer to bounce things off of and learn from is very key.
I appreciate that. I think one, it probably would be helpful for you to share a little bit how you're doing that, because I'm sure that there are people that are in the same boat and are looking for, what's my entry point, how do I start to understand what this is all about. And then we could also talk a little bit more about what are the things that you need to consider, because HTML5 in the AV world is a little bit different than HTML5 for websites in general. And I think that that might be a good conversation for us to continue, to how the world of programming, when translated to AV, is just a different animal.
So yeah, I agree. It's a different animal, and I'm quite not versed enough to know the difference between HTML5 for web developing and for AV control at this moment. So I have a background in programming for IT. I've done web developing. So that's where I'm starting first. And Raspberry Pi, I did a LAMP setup. For those people who don't understand what a LAMP setup is, it's a Linux, Apache, MySQL, and Python. So it's you throw Linux on there, you throw Apache as your web server, then your MySQL for your database, and Python is the programming language. And I just started going, okay, what can I do with HTML5? I came up with a project in my head, and I've just been slowly working on that and making adjustments here and there, saying, okay, this is HTML5, this is standard HTML, and it's more probably web developing right now. But once I feel I got a grasp of it, I could probably revert it to AV control.
I think that that makes sense. And I think that in general, that's probably the approach that most people would take. If we go back to our topic about what's the future look like, and how do programmers get there, and how do they expand their skills and knowledge. I think what you just described is a great example of it. Find a little project to do, target the technology that you're looking to learn, and just dig in.
Yeah, I definitely, I think especially for programmers, I found programmers they need a project. You can't just sit down, like a writer can sit down and kind of write, but you got kind of have a topic. Same thing with programming is we could probably write programming, but if you don't have a project in mind, you're throwing mud on the wall. You got to have a goal and an object, I believe.
That makes perfect sense. So if we were to answer that question about, what's the future look like, and what are the things that you need to learn, um, there one of the things that I would talk about is that there's a common belief that you can have programmers that went to school for programming and bring them into the AV world, and if the languages are the same, that they're going to be successful, and you could find people off the street. And I just don't think that's that easy. And I know, as somebody who's an employer, that it isn't. And but then there's the other side of the coin, where you're looking at how do you take a quote unquote AV guy and get them into programming. And then you have a little bit of a different spin, because your background is IT and knowing how to write code, but also it almost falls in between. Um, I think that one of the things that I want to point out, and maybe we could comment a little bit about, is that the constraints that are provided in the AV world can be very frustrating to somebody who's used to having a full reign, having all the tools, whether it's using software that has any library that they choose, or any language that they choose, or even understanding the application and the users. It's a very different world that AV is, and when it comes to programming.
Yes, it's definitely a different world. I'll admit, I came into this, I felt a little easier, but not 100%. There is definitely things I have to learn and build, but I think the to go with the question about the future of AV, I think the future of AV programming is going to be IT centric. It's going to be the IT modern language, your C sharp, your Python, and your HTML5. Because what the benefit of those is they can run on any platform. Um, Unlike like say you use AMX, you write in netlinks, you're only running that on AMX equipment. You're not going to throw that on a Crestron, a QSC. Same thing with Crestron. Their languages are going to only run on their platforms. So this opens the door for more integration. And I feel that's really the future of AV programming is learning these IT-centric languages.
So that's interesting, because I would agree, and when I talk to my team, one of the things that comes up often is understanding software development principles, understanding object oriented programming style, and architecting your code, and then you can apply those universal skills and um, the those principles to any language. So to me, I guess, answering the question of, what is the future is, we're saying modern programming, and then we're also saying, hey, go learn what software development you need to be able to succeed in doing it.
Yes, and don't get the discouraged because it's a learning curve, especially if you're not used to modern language. Like when I came from what I was really good in C sharp. I wrote stuff in C sharp, and I came into AV, and it took me probably a good day to 2.5 days to actually just sitting down and looking at the old programmer's code and going, okay, this does this. Okay, this does that. Like following along because that object learning the language was there, the structure was there. So it took me a little bit to follow the new syntax, but at least the foundation, the framework was there, and had my background in the C sharp help. But like the Python, PHP, and HTML5 is all new to me. So like I said, instead of jumping in, I just started with a small project that I'm building from here and there. It's just simple, like a database running a simple inventory system and trying to add to it and go, well, it would be cool if we had this feature and just focus on that. Once you learn the framework, everything else will come.
So as we're going to start wrapping up, I think we could tease a couple of topics that we'll be covering in the future. One being training, and another one being, these resources for learning. Um, a question for you, and this might be yet another topic that we cover in the future, likely will, is, do you think that the language will be driving the future, or the hardware will be driving the future?
I think it's going to be a language. We're already seeing a huge move to cloud. So I think hardware, it's going to be a less of a driving factor, and software is going to be the driving factor.
Interesting. Well, I think a good thing for programmers to know, and a really good takeaway from this. Uh, as we wrap up, I just wanted to mention something from the last or one of our previous recordings where something that just hit me after we stopped, that we talked about the importance of being organized, and how that, and if that was a requirement for a programmer, and you had asked me about somebody having their work or area organized and so forth. And one of the things that hit me, and I meant to mention it, is that being too organized can also be a detriment. So it's that whole idea of perfect being an enemy of done, and I've seen that occur. So I just wanted to mention that, just to kind of tie in our episodes. I don't know if do you have anything to share in the same regard?
No, actually, I think that's a great tie-in and great advice right there.
Well, as we close for today, wanted to just share it with everybody that a couple of big announcements is that if you are seeing us on YouTube, welcome. Please subscribe, and that's we have an Ask the Programmer channel, and we're also going to, as of just today, believe it or not, we are now having an audio only podcast and you could find it on podcast platforms like Apple and Android and so forth. So check us out there and subscribe. For those who want to reach us, James wanted to kick that off and let them know how to reach you, and also any closing messages you wanted to share.
I mean, again, this is great. Thank you for our listeners. This is just something that Steve and I were spitballing, and we were going to see where it came, and a lot larger than we saw up front, which is great. As we mentioned on the other two, you can get me at a Twitter, AV_James King, or on LinkedIn, and also our YouTube channel and our podcast.
Excellent. And for me, you could reach me at Steve Greenblatt on social media platforms, and please continue reaching out and giving us feedback. This is really fueling us. And I mentioned on Twitter that it's a passion project, and it's really something that we're going to be taking this as far as the audience leads us, and we want this to be a great thing, but it gets driven by the feedback that we receive. So we look forward to hearing from you and speaking with you sometime very soon.